Yep, I can hear you.
All right, great. Um, I'll just screen share for the timer. And with that, I think, okay, I can't screen share it in this room. Okay, so I just request everyone to use timers themselves. If anyone needs me to give any sorts of messages for time notifications, please let me know just before your speech. Without any further ado, I invite the first affirmative to begin. Here.
Uh, Hi, please confirm if I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
All right, if at any point I get too choppy or disconnect, please give me a call so that I know this is happening. I'm going
Sure.
to be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Problematic and racist depictions that cause young, impressionable children to internalize problematic stereotypes have absolutely no place in public discourse. We think Disney needs to take these these problematic movies out of circulation. I'm going to be doing 3 things in this speech. First, I'm going to be doing some framing and setup about what this debate is about. Second, I'm going to talk to you about what these caricatures look like and why they are so problematic. Third, I'm going to talk to you about how these depictions reinforce stereotypes, especially in the most impressionable minds. And finally, what the counterfactual is and why that's so much better. First, framing. First, this is not an actor debate or based on Disney, which means that it doesn't really matter too much in this debate if Disney wants to do it or not. It's about whether they ought to, given the wider societal implications that these movies have. The second thing to note here is that we do not think disclaimers work. These audiences are mostly children. Parental influence might not be good enough, cannot sit and explain each and every nuance of these shows. And we think that underlying biases of parents, for example, in the American South, continue to exist because they may be biased in themselves and don't understand the nuances of these racial undertones. There are still cultural stereotypes at play. We don't think putting a 10-second disclaimer is going to change anything at all. The third thing it's set up to note here is that the tag of Disney is often a huge indicator of trust within children's entertainment. Parents will often watch a movie just because it's a Disney kids show without putting in any research, without putting in any prior thought. But secondly, we think because Disney has been so popular, it has set the tone for animation in a lot of other places, in that things like Pixar, for example, also are incentivized and were incentivized to put out similar depictions. They set the tone for this kind of racism. What do these movies or cartoon depictions look like? In Dumbo, you have like the crows talking in a Southern American accent, and you also name them things like Jim Crow, which was a law that legitimized the oppression of Black people within America. Things like Aladdin, for example, where all the negative characters were shown to be Arabs and dark-skinned only. Things like Sound of the South, that talks about African Americans on plantations and gives a comical touch to their life and to their struggles, with like songs like Hanging Black People on Trees and Give Me a Rope and Find Me a Tree, etc. We think these are incredibly distasteful. I think they are incredibly problematic. What do we think the removal of these things looks like? First, you think that you remove it from like TV, movies, or any merchandise associated Disney, we are okay with removing Disney World rights themed on it, etc. Second, we think that any semblance of this character in any Disney reference should be stopped. So a negative cannot say in this debate that we just come up with better versions of these characters. We're going to take out these things out from the root. Finally, we think that we can also like give these things to academic circles if they want to have research or have academic discourse about what these racist depictions look like. But we do not think they should exist within public spheres. So what do these caricatures specifically look like, and why are they so problematic? So the first thing to note here is that these caricatures are often created by the producers of the show to depict certain characteristics and traits of some communities, their accent, their lifestyle. And these traits are exaggerated beyond life to give a comical touch to those characters. What this looks, for example, in a modern depiction is like Apu in Simpsons, which is who has a rarely American accent, and his Indian lifestyle is the butt of several jokes within the show. We think that this is exactly the kind of caricaturing that is largely prevalent in most other Disney shows. Why is this so problematic? We think first in that it creates stereotypes. Often these shows bank on the fact that making fun of minorities through exaggerating their lifestyle choices will give us laughs from the white audience. The harm is that these communities feel that these shows are maliciously portraying their cultural identity and making fun of them. But second, we think that this leads to the misconception of the cultures of these minority characters and their characteristics. Notice that it is always the minority character who talks in a weird accent, looks weird, and is portrayed to be the comic relief, and is never often a mainstream, and this is never a mainstream white character in these shows. So, and this is the most important thing, why do we think that these shows depicting caricatures should be removed and not regulated like within society? The first thing to note here is that we think that these shows influence the most vulnerable and the most impressionable in society, that is children. Often, we think that these children look up to these characters, adore them, and base their childhood around the fantasy that Disney tries to sell you, right? We think that these children often don't have the ability to filter out these thoughts and stereotypes because they haven't been exposed to the world and haven't been exposed to like a diverse group of individuals at large from a very young age. We therefore think that these depictions often end up reinforcing stereotypes that are culturally already present. Why is that the case? You often see these movies in an incredibly informal setting. You're just chilling with your family with a bowl of popcorn. No one is ever engaging in any critical thought or any critical discourse about the kind of movie that you just watched, about the problematic nuances that you go ahead and that you see that have been depicted within movies. The reason why this becomes so much worse is because children and parents often lives within their own bubbles. They often have certain reservations about and stereotypes about these communities anyways, right? They often have never had meaningful interactions with members of these groups. We think what therefore happens is because there is never any circuit breaker when you are incredibly young. We often think that the kind of depictions that you see end up reinforcing these terrible stereotypes, and we just don't think we have any ability to be able to regulate this kind of behaviors within an incredibly informal setting. We don't think that you can send a teacher to every single house after a person has watched a Disney movie and tell them what it's really about. But secondly, we think this becomes incredibly problematic because these depictions are often the most prominent depictions of these minority groups that people see for a long time of your life. You might not interact with an Asian, for example, until you end up going to a university and you end up meeting these people. We think what therefore happens is that through the kind of implicit conditioning that happens, even if explicitly these characters aren't racist or demeaning, seeing all these Indians talk in a funny accent, or Asians always being shown as having inferior characteristics or being as bad characters, play into the psychology of that child, and this is something that they hold on to for their young other lives. The fact, therefore, that childhood is an incredibly impressionable age where you learn things, we think it becomes incredibly difficult for you to unlearn this racism later because it's already embedded within your subconscious. It is exactly why a large number of programs, for example, are run in school to sensitize children from a young age around about the stereotypes. And we think this work is entirely undone when they get a completely different message from the kind of Disney shows that they're watching that we think these children adore and that these children love. We think that this sets back society a lot. The reason why we therefore think that these problematic depictions are so terrible is because first, we think that the interactions that you have with these groups are largely going to be colored by these racist depictions. These depictions mean that these children treat other groups these other minority groups really, really badly because of these internalized feelings. This has long-term consequences, such as bullying and like catcalling that you're going to have to face throughout your schooling. We think this has incredibly long-term consequences. But even when it's not like leading to direct racism, we think this leads to a lot more microaggression towards individuals of the group that we think is incredibly humiliating and damaging when, for example, you are constantly compared to this one character, because this one character is often the only like cultural depiction of that minority group. And we think that therefore that these behaviors, things like bullying, for example, are incredibly hard to regulate and incredibly hard to fix. And finally, we think that these groups and these minority groups themselves, when they like watch these Disney movies in good faith, often end up internalizing those feelings of inadequacy and those feelings of humiliation themselves when they've been taught this at an incredibly young age. We think this is really problematic. So why do we think that the world is better off when we take these depictions away? We prefer a world where such movies don't exist in public discourse, which exaggerate those traits and characteristics. We are okay with minority depiction done in a really, really respectful way that is not comic or grotesque. So therefore, what ends up happening on our paradigm is that each child who grows up watching these Disney movies from now on does not get a distorted racial mindset within their mind and is much more likely to respect those cultures equally because these problematic depictions no longer exist. On their side, when minority communities' behavior is made fun of, they are much more likely to fixate on their mind. There's going to be a lot more bullying. We are incredibly proud to propose.
I thank first affirmative. I invite first negative. Here.
Hello, am I audible? Hello?
Yes, you're audible.
I want to make very clear the model coming from negative bench. So I will concede that a 5-second disclaimer is not enough, but that is not what we are going to be propping. We are going to have a very disclaimer with red flashing lights if you want, such that it actually becomes understandable, such that it catches the attention of the people watching, such that people actually read the disclaimer and say what it's about. And notice that this disclaimer is not just going to be like, this came from a different time. This disclaimer in itself will say things that this movie, for example, contains depiction from a less accepting time, and we should not condone hateful generalizations of ethnicities. It will explicitly say that these things were racist then, and it's definitely racist now. Another part of our model that I want to make clear, we also support the increased rating of all of these shows so that children don't watch this alone. I think then if you make it PG to an extent, then a parent is literally forced, or not literally forced, or literally inclined to watch these things with their children, such that they can actually explain these things. The last part of the model is that we believe Disney should use all of the money they gain from keeping these movies in circulation, through royalties, through the DVD copies, and all of these things, and donate that money to the groups that have historically been oppressed per film, or who exactly that they are discriminating and they're generalizing about in this film. I have 2 points that I want to run today. First, on this, how this allows Disney to wash the hands of their crimes and their racism. And secondly, I'm going to talk about why it's particularly helpful for the fight against stereotypes. But before I move on to that, a few responses to the previous speaker. So the first response here is to the claim, parents can't teach you about racism, but he doesn't really explain why this is true. So the first level of my response to this is that it's not true that parents can't teach you about racism. So I will concede that parents can't necessarily explain the complexity of why racism exists or all the institutions that contribute to racism. But it's not hard to say to your child that this is a bad thing. Do not treat your friend this way. This depiction is wrong. Do not do this in school. So I think this in itself is not as complex as the previous speaker says it up to be. And secondly, on the idea of racist parents that might even use this narrative to forward their own agenda. Notice that racist parents are going to be racist parents in either paradigm. So whether or not they have a show to talk about Black people or African American people is very much dilutes the harm of these racist parents on our side. I think they're going to be racist either way. The second thing that they claim is that kids are not exposed and very much isolated within their environment. So they aren't exposed to a diverse set of people. Notice that this is also asserted, and this is just simply not true. Children do not stay at home, for example, for the rest of their lives. Notice that children are exposed to current TV shows that are incredibly diverse, that tackle things like discrimination and othering of individuals. Also notice that these children go to school, and I think the vast majority of schools are actually diverse in itself in a way. So I think these children are not exposed, as the previous speaker says, to be. What do all of these rebuttals aim to do? I think this dilutes a lot of the harms and that they supposedly say our side have, therefore you cannot credit them to their full extent. This brings me to my first point on how principally Disney should not be allowed to wash their hands of their racist past. Under 2 levels. First, why this allows Disney's sins to be forgotten. So I just want to make a parallelism here, right? We ought to hold Disney accountable and not forget the things they did in the past. Why? So if corporations commit crimes or make racist remarks, we do not let them forget it. If individuals commit crimes, we do not let them forget it. So I think in the same way, if a corporation is blatantly discriminatory, we should not actively forget all of the things that they did or the statements that they made. So this contact, rather, the keeping of all of this stuff is a clear show of Disney's failings that allow people to remember that mass media can also be racist, that the mass media giant that you've trusted can also be racist as well. Notice that in a world they don't exist, all of their sins are largely forgotten, and Disney has no obligation to do anything for the people it harmed. Even if, for example, the next speaker will say Disney can apologize before they take it out of circulation. As time passes, future generations are not exposed to that apology or have that information. So eventually, if you have no access to the fact that they apologize, if you have no access to the to the show in itself that literally shows a disclaimer that Disney did something wrong, you also forget that the corporation has done all these things. So if you believe Disney ought to be remembered and acknowledged for their sins, then you're going to have to give it to negative. But the second level here is that this is also a form of reparation. Notice our model that Disney is obligated then to donate all of the earnings they get from keeping its circulation to the oppressed minority groups that they've harmed. So this gives reparations back to the communities affected by their depiction. And I think then is a way of like just principally holding Disney accountable for all of the things that they've done in the past. We allow Disney to do the right thing on negative bench. It is unclear whether Disney is going to be held accountable on affirmative. So let's talk about the second point here. That actually helps and is actually helpful to fight against the racist stereotypes. So I think this is where my case is in contention with what the previous speaker was talking about. 3 levels as to why it helps fight the racist stereotypes. First, it exposes racism for its actual manifestations. Why? I think seeing a TV show shows that racism is in the past, for example, wasn't just about the real life, very obvious racist interaction people had. It wasn't just the KKK or segregation, but it also persevered in mass media. Why is this important that we acknowledge racism in that particular front? Because we ought to criticize as well the structures that allowed such things to be put in the media in the first place and allowed these people to feel to receive the brunt of all of these bad stereotypes. So I think with the more holistic understanding of the manifestation of racism, we actually get to critique these structures that allowed this to happen a lot more on our side of the house. The second reason why it's helpful to fight the racist stereotypes is because it provides real life education on stereotypes, right? So notice that some of the sentiment around these stereotypes and these caricatures still exist, and albeit in more discrete forms. For example, it happens in the news when they racially profile individuals that they report about. That in itself is a perpetration of a lot of the stereotypes that we talk about. Therefore, you ought to educate children on how untrue these stereotypes actually are. How do we do this on negative bench? Notice that you are obligated to have parent guidance. So when you encounter these things, the parents can explain to you that this is a wrong depiction, that it is factually untrue. Do not treat your friends this way. But secondly, the great thing about like a cartoon and all of these things, it's a visual aid that helps young individuals better understand a concept that is very difficult to wrap your head around. So I think it's actually a good thing that they're having this conversation in front of the TV and in front of a visual aid that can help them understand such complex concepts. But thirdly, I'm going to concede that not all parents are good parents and are willing to take that step of really educating their children. So this is where I'm going to engage about bad parents and why we still win under that front. Notice that bad parents are likely to romanticize the past in which they came from, the cartoons that they think are very sentimental and that they love. So I think that also comes with romanticizing the racism and discrimination of the past as well. Notice that kids can read these disclaimers as well. So I think just because there's a disclaimer doesn't mean it's overly complex. I think Nickelodeon does this quite often, especially when they were talking about the moment of silence for the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think children very much understood that disclaimer that they aired. Or notice that there will probably also be comments on the side that pop up, for example, when you get to the racist depiction part, that therefore children can read and question the romanticization of their parents' past or whatever their parents are saying about the past and all of these things. In a world where these children are not exposed to those things, they're just ought to believe, or more likely to believe rather, that this is the parents' past that I should also be embodying and love. Notice that the previous speaker already implicitly concedes that if a parent is good and is willing to educate their children, then we win. But I've already engaged that even if that wasn't true, and even in the worst case scenario, we still win in that regard. Thanks.
I thank first negative. I invite second affirmative. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Give me 10 seconds. If one of the chairs or judges does not mind putting the video on, it just makes for a more engaging speech. If that's okay for you guys. Thanks a lot. Just give me 10. Let's get. Starting my speech in 3, sorry, video's gone. Yeah, great. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In a world where racism is rampant in every section of society, and when caricatures go and reinforce that in the most impressionable minds of society, we regret that world. We want Disney to remove these reinforcements of stereotypes. But before I move on, I'll be giving two things in the speech. The first, I'll tell you what is the counterfactual like on our side to create the same discourse which negative wants to talk about. But second, I'll respond to every single claim which first negative makes. The first claim they make is, oh, we can have a disclaimer with red flashing lights so you attract the attention of children. Let's take them at their best. Sure, it catches my attention as a 5-year-old child, but as long as I don't understand the underlying meaning of those words, like racial connotations, like historically bad, etc., does not mean I will actually go and think about that. But secondly, this ignores the analysis by first affirmative when it tells you most of these racial connotations are very, very implicit in nature, which means it's very, very hard for a child to pick up and go and explicitly say, oh, look, this is racist, because there's things like language, things like diction, etc., which you go and assume to be true, which you assume to be the case for all gender, for all minorities, etc. But second, right, when they conceive it so problematic, why exactly do they want these caricatures to exist in the public space in the first place? But second, right, they say, oh, look, parental regulation is possible. This again ignores the analysis from first affirmative when it tells you the first thing. Disney is a trusted brand, right? Parents oftentimes associate Disney with child movies, movies that can be trusted and don't require parental regulation. You can just leave your children with his friends to go and watch it. But secondly, right, it's not always possible for a parent to follow their child and sit with them constantly and look at the movie. But thirdly, right, they never tell you why all parents are liberal or understand racism, right? Parents have their own biases. Parents are large parts of the time racist. But even if they're not, right, it's very, very hard for you to catch these racial undertones when you don't have facts and figures yourself. That is to say, when I don't know myself, how is it that these Asian communities actually interact amongst themselves or they actually exist? I am likely to buy this interpretation because I trust Disney so much. Disney is a reputed brand existing for hundreds of years. The third thing they claim is this. Disney can donate money. It's a form of repercussions. First thing to note is this. Disney cannot undo the damage which they cause to these minorities and to cause these people who live in these areas, right? The microaggressions that they face on a daily basis, the catcalling that I face in school, the bullying that I'll face in university, the rejections I get for my job, these things cannot be undone by a few $100,000 of donation in a local charity, right? We think that can be done simultaneously as well. We're okay with that. Not sure why you want to have caricatures and use that money for it. We think Disney has enough money to do that if they really want to go and be nice to the communities. But secondly, right, we think on our side of the house, when you actually go and force Disney to remove it, it's only then when Disney actually has to pay the price for racial depictions, right? When they literally don't get the fame and the sort of publicity for these movies, when they don't earn the money from these movies, it's only then when Disney takes the hardest hit and is discouraged from making more movies, right? First affirmative told you, right? Disney is a trendsetter in the animation space. Even Pixar was now gone and incentivized to produce similar movies because they thought, oh, Disney is doing it, it's so popular, it might be okay. At the point at which you go and force a major production house to go and take all this out, it sets a huge precedent for everyone else, which means the consequential effects of this on the entire industry and the implication of racist attitudes in general is something we really want, not just tokenistic few dollars given by Disney. But the fourth thing is this, right? They say, oh, look, kids already have exposure. This is literally ridiculous, right? It's a zero-sum game when it comes to things like movie shows because children don't have all the time in the world. They're likely to trade off between watching one show or the other. It's not like I will first watch a Disney movie, then go and watch a documentary which tells me about racism in Africa, etc. That's not likely. Children likely watch cartoons and caricatures for fun and entertainment, which means Disney is always likely to be their first choice. But second, they give you no reason to believe what are these alternate sources of TV shows which exist for children in the first place. Why do they actually go and depict racism in true lives and they educate children? No example or no analysis of why that's actually likely. But the third thing to note under this is this, right? Exposure does not just mean watching TV, right? It means interacting with communities physically, having a chance to understand the nuances and the characteristics of the racial minorities you think about and have colored images about, right? It's only when I go to a university or a space where I have the privilege to go and interact with them do I actually understand that all my biases were probably untrue. These people are actually much better than I've been taught for so long. But the last thing to say is this. Oh, Disney will now become accountable. People cannot forget the problems that happen. The first thing to note is this. We really want people to forget the fact that you literally go and glorify black people being hung on trees on farmhouses in the past, right? We literally want people to not go and idolize the fact that racist undertones are good and that all Indians have a bad accent and you cannot understand them. It's supposed to be comical in nature. We're okay with people not thinking these are legitimate things as long as we have a better understanding of what these racial minorities look like. But let's move on to the last response for them when they say this acknowledges racism. There is no analysis on why caricatures are the only way to do so, or why do we need cartoons to be able to go and acknowledge racism, right? Children, for most matters, as first affirmative told you, just watch it for fun. Parents oftentimes don't know these things themselves, which means if they really want to go and educate children, I'll tell you multiple reasons why that's possible even on our side. First reason is we think we can still have discourse on the kind of racism education they want to talk about by having actual minority characters going and talking about their issues in the first place. Disney can make movies in collaboration with production houses in Asia and Africa, etc., and they can have really authentic depictions of what these characteristics look like, not just depicting them as always as funny and grotesque. But secondly, right, if parents on their side are so proactive and care so much about racism, etc., they can literally show children child-friendly documentaries. They can talk about these issues in normal circumstances as well. When they tell them, look, don't go and bully that African American child in your class because he's literally probably smarter than you. He's the same as you. We're all equal. If parents are literally so proactive, we don't even see why you really need caricatures to do that. But the only analysis for that is this, right? Oh, caricatures are fun. It's more interactive for children. We told you on their side of the house, children can never understand this themselves, right? Which means they rely on a post facto education by parents to go and correct for the reinforcement of stereotypes in children's head. In a scenario where parents fail to do that in a good manner, this means this child will now carry this stereotype in his head all through his life and will literally go and be racist throughout his life. Which means they need to prove why is it that in all possible cases, parents are able to go and correct for this reinforcement on their side of the house. We think it's impossible for them to do that in this debate. But the last thing in this debate, right? Why do we think the world on our side is much better when you remove these things from history itself, right? The first thing is this, right? We think at the point at which you go and remove these shows, we're likely to have other shows to replace them, which probably talk about these minorities in a better light, right? Which are probably, even at their best case, when they don't talk about minorities, they're probably just going to be normal shows which don't depict a bad form of the racial minorities, right? But secondly, right, children grow up to be not reinforced with stereotypes, right? We told you in first affirmative that children are extremely impressionable, right? The things and the traits they pick up in the childhood are likely to be stuck around with them all through their lives, right? Which means it's very, very hard for me to correct for racism unless I'm really, really privileged and I have the social circles to do that. Most people just believe these things to be true and take it with them all along their lives. So it's extremely crucial for us to correct for this at the very onset of this actually happening. The last thing to note is this, right? We think Disney as a company, as they want to punish on their side, literally gets hit the hardest. And not just Disney, right? The entire industry gets a wake-up call when they see that at the point at which we go just for like some amount of money and some amount of popularity, go and show minorities and go and show these people who are so underprivileged in a bad light or just make fun of them, we are likely to be punished by this society. We're likely to have to recall and reject all our material. We think all these things mean we have a better world, a world which recognizes that everybody is equal, that racism is unacceptable, and that does not rely on the subjective experiences of parents to correct for the children, because we think that world does not exist today. We're not sure it exists on their side. We're very proud to propose.
I thank second affirmative. I invite second negative. Here.
Hello, can I be heard? Okay, wonderful. By the way, no Zoom background for this speech since this is a pretty serious topic and issue. Second AF presents to us the problem that racism is everywhere and pervasive in society. And then he says, because of that, children will grow up and magically become inundated with this racism and then grow up to become kind citizens without this caricature. We think that's wrong. We think the comparative is a world steeped in racism will continue to make children racist. And the caricature and the reframing of previous cartoons is the best way we can introduce children to racism from a young age and tell them that these things are wrong. I will do three things in this speech. Firstly, explain the unique value of a caricature and why it is important to reframe it in the context of today's progressivism. Secondly, I'll be explaining why all their material is wrong. And then thirdly, I'll be bringing back Irene and explain why you stop idealizing the past, affecting parents and having more good parents overall. Firstly, on caricatures. They say that children watch caricatures for fun and entertainment. This is untrue in this context. Here's why. 3 reasons. Firstly, the value of a caricature is that certain characteristics are exaggerated in order to create a grotesque effect, one that is clearly unreal and not attached to society or rather not attached to real life or a real person. This is relevant because I think it detaches the existence of a caricature from actual individuals. So when you pair that with the lens of this being a wrongful depiction that people genuinely believed in the past, children are capable of understanding that people in the past were so racist that they actually believe these caricatures, and that would be broadly a bad thing. The second thing is that this caricature is contextualized within the framework of a cartoon, within the framework of a story. I would like to bring up some of these examples and then point out why AF's material proves that we win this issue. Song of the South has depictions of Black Americans with big lips, lazy demeanor, and being content as slaves. Peter Pan has a song that uses slurs against Native Americans, and the Jungle Book applies stereotypes once more of African Americans to orangutans. AF presents to you the idea that these things are so exaggerated that it would be difficult to believe them to be real. If that is the case, then this makes it the perfect visual aid to display just how racist people were in the past. Instead of relying people to understand racism through the sinuous, underlying, and subtle nature of racism in other places today, we allow children to have a brief and easily understandable comprehension of racism. So if their explanation is that children have a hard time understanding the underlying point of racism, this is how we get them to understand these things. By showing to you that racism is not just violence on people on the street, but it is saying on a TV show that Black people look like monkeys, like orangutans, that it is okay to use slurs against the people you took land from and then genocided them. We think that this is the best way to introduce children to racism in a world that is already racist. AF does not present a solution to the problem, and that's why we win. Secondly, direct refutation to most of AF's points. The first thing I want to refute is their point on reparation. Since this is my favorite part of our model, I thought it was cute. So their first response is, their first response is that Disney cannot do undamage and bullying and microaggression by paying people money. And the second thing is, we also want to do this model. So the first reason why this works for us is because even though it doesn't undo these things, it makes the life of minorities easier. It gives them money, and it gives people in communities money to survive and make the day-to-day experience easier. It lets them avoid microaggressions by taking on better options for themselves. It lets them pay for valuable opportunities such as schooling and education. Why does AF not get to do this model? Very explicitly, the money for this reparation came from having these films in circulation in the first place. If they remove these films from circulation, then they cannot donate this money to these people if they don't have the money to give them in the first place. But the third thing is, there's also less likely to be criticism to push Disney to give people this money because of the fact that they've already removed the films from the public eye, and as such, there is no critical lens on these things. And lastly, to impact this, they make the claim that every other agency will follow Disney. This is a totally hanging point, but if we prove it, then it means that every other agency, such as Pixar, any other children's film, any other like Warner Brothers Studios, right? These people will also start giving money to these communities by following Disney's footsteps. So if you totally believe that's true, then we multiply our impact by a gajillion. That's the first response, and it proves we win the reparation point. The second response I have is for their point about Disney being a trusted brand and that you view films within the context of casualness, so you won't critically interrogate this film. There are 3 responses to this. The first is that this is the first step to have it not be a trusted brand. I don't think AF presents any solutions to these things, especially when some people still have copies of these things at home. It's not as if removing it from circulation removes that people have had childhoods attached to these things, that you still, your parents probably still have a copy of the Jungle Book at home. It doesn't mean that when you remove it from circulation, parents will stop showing it to children. It just means that Disney stops making money from it. So they don't actually solve the problem. The way we change it is that when we introduce it to people, we add the lens of the content warning that makes it such that you're forced to reevaluate it. The second is, we broadly speaking solve this. So broadly speaking, we also think that it's generally untrue that you don't critically analyze these Disney films at all, especially when many Disney films are known for tackling deep and rather complex issues such as racism, or even just like being like in Mulan, right? So stuff like that, like where it's difficult to be a woman in times of war, it's difficult to be a woman in general in society, right? And I don't think it's difficult that if Disney has a reputation for tackling hard to understand issues, it might also be the same way here. But the last thing is, even if it is the case that people cannot critically interrogate it in any way, shape, or form, the way people can then interrogate it in their lives is that when they compare these exaggerations to actual interactions with these people, which is what AF rely on to fix their problems, the disjunct between the caricature and the real life person becomes even more pervasive and even easier to understand. So the exact value of a caricature is that it is hard to compare to a real life person, and thus the distinction between a stereotype and a person becomes even more clear. That's why we solve that problem. So at the end of these refutations, we've responded to three crucial things that win us a point. Firstly, the marginal change on money. We totally win that. Secondly, the hanging point about Disney being a trust brand. And thirdly, about the value of a caricature. So the last thing I will do is explain why you stop idealizing the past, and this is broadly a good thing. This point explains how we change parents. I think the point I think AF is generally pessimistic about affecting parents. So if let's assume that their framing is true, that no, like good parents aren't affected at all and bad parents aren't affected at all. So we'll be talking about parents in the middle. Why is it that parents are capable of changing their views and retrospecting on their childhoods? So broadly speaking, again, these parents normally idealize their past because it is enshrouded in the sepia of nostalgia. It is like they smooth over the bad parts in their film, or they view it in a different way. So when you don't consume these things as a parent, or when you consume it without the content warning, then you will just see it as normal and teach it to kids as normal, or implicitly pass on the lessons to your kids as normal. So these parents don't change in AF's world. Like either they don't interact with it or they interact with it in the same way because of their old copies of it. How do we change that? So if parents are intelligent enough to understand content warnings and they're not biased towards a liberal or a right-wing way, then when they see these caricatures again and when they interrogate them in the light of racism and in the light of the fact that this was done in a past that was unacceptable, these parents now are comparatively more likely to change their views than in a world where they had done nothing at all. Broadly speaking, we can apply the material from our caricature here, as well as all the points that Irene presented to you that they did not respond to. The points about how parental guidance means that you are obligated to take care of your child better, the fact that this is recontextualized within the light of racism and suffering. So for these reasons, we negate. Thank you.
I thank second negative. I invite third affirmative. Here.
What's that? Please check what's that?
Hello. Okay, cool. Okay. Yeah, just give me 10 seconds, all right? Panel, this debate, negative side in this debate needed to prove a crucial role that movies which depict racial behavior actually play. They can't just run away by simply saying, oh no, we want to present the negative side or the downsides of these movies, and also want these children to actually see these movies, and we'll also have a disclaimer for them to actually understand and not watch those movies in the first place, right? I think it's a ridiculous assumption from side negative to assume that children are smarter to actually understand those disclaimers and understand those nuances and to be able to not apply that sort of behavior in real life. They have never provided any reason why we can't teach children about racism by like through documentaries, through other mediums, why that necessarily needs to happen through these form of mechanisms. We can also teach children through documentaries. That is to say, we can simply criticize the like behavior towards black people by the white people in the 1800s and 1900s. They can learn through history books. They don't need to watch that show in order for them to understand. Because children are gullible and are widely impressionable, I'm not sure why they will be able to rationalize it in the real world, which is why I don't agree with side negative, and they've never given you enough reasons to actually believe what they're saying is actually true. We gave you start from the get-go, give you reasons. These shows play an active role in furthering stereotypes against minorities, which leads to more microaggressions, right? Which we got no responses to. I'm going to do four things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to respond to the previous speaker. Then I'm going to deal with this idea of are parents able to teach children. Thirdly, I'm going to deal with this idea whether they'll be able to whether you'll be able to whether on this idea of accountability, whether Disney is more accountable on our side. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how these microaggressions uniquely happen through these shows, which is why it's okay to ban them. Firstly, I'm going to deal with this idea whether disclaimers are the real way in which children can understand them. Firstly, look, you don't need these caricatures to teach racism to kids. You can literally teach them without the existence of these caricatures. How? They wanted to introduce racism to children, but the problem is if I'm not able to comprehend the disclaimer, but I see that people in the real world are actually exhibiting racist behaviors towards like minorities, and there is no active criticism done in the same movie, I'm not sure that I would be able to understand or perceive or interpret that it's actually racist behavior, and I shouldn't replicate that in real life. The problem is caricatures, value of a caricature is not just to create a grotesque image, but also a funny one. So probably if you see a lot of sitcoms, you will have representation of minorities, but they'll be made fun of. There's no discussions within those sitcoms that you should not make fun of minorities. So at the end of the day, children are going to get embedded, their minds are going to get embedded with the fact that it's okay for you to make fun of because people around you do the same, right? The detachment they talk about, that is to say, detachment they talk about never happens in the children's mind. We never say it's unbelievable, rather it's exaggerated, and children tend to believe in it. We got no responses to that. But secondly, they say it's difficult to believe to be real. Children don't understand those nuances. Most of this racism is also implicit. Children don't understand it. We got no engagement on that side of the house. And we gave you a lot of alternatives in which you can actually teach about the authentic experience of minorities. Things like documentary discussions, they never prove why those mediums are ineffective means of teaching racism to children, why you need mediums like which Disney banks on and gets a lot of profits by recirculation of those movies to actually teach racism to those kids. We never got any responses to that, right? No analysis why children are so clever or have the ability to distinguish between the reality and the character, right? Because look, most of these children watch this for fun and entertainment, right? They are not able to comprehend the nuances that are associated with the racist racist behavior of some like majoritarian communities, right? We think that they sort of in real life assume that these things happen in real life, it's okay for you to do so, right? And the next they say that look, probably if you remove like Jungle Book, parents are still going to make sure that the children watch it. But the benefit on our side of the house is there's going to be lesser circulation of Disney movies. So probably movies that are there with parents right now will continue to exist, but over a long generation, when generations continue to come, you won't have these movies anymore. So probably it's a benefit that people don't see, don't actually legitimize the racism that is actually actually portrayed in this movies, right? So if a parent doesn't have a copy, he won't be able to buy for you anymore. Lastly, on money, look, we make movies with better representation and give minorities that money. You don't need to actually make movies with poor representation and give money that comes out of that profit to minorities, right? Look, Disney is a huge production house, so not just making racist movies, which means they suffer a huge financial hit, but don't go bankrupt. So probably they'll have some losses, but they still have enough capital to make movies that actually portray the correct behavior. So if they want to effectuate some radical change on their side, we can co-opt that on our side as well, right? But then they say Disney movies are complex. Absolutely ridiculous lie. Old movies don't have this nuance at all. Frozen is the new, Mulan is recent. It literally talks about the fairies and beasts. Children just laugh at these and want to emulate them. They probably think about blackface, things like blackface are okay when they see Dumbo, etc. Right? We think this is reason that children are not able to comprehend the nuances. They have not given enough reasons to actually to make us believe that, right? Next, I'm going to talk about parents. I'm going to bifurcate parents in three categories. Firstly, if parents are not, firstly, their idea about parents are not racist. Firstly, it's ridiculous. Most of the parents are actually racist. If racism was like, if people weren't racist, racist, racism would not have been a problem in America or over the world, so which we don't think. The reason racism is a problem because parents don't think that racism is a rampant problem. So they might not be inherently racist, but they think it's okay for their child to actually watch Disney movies. Why? Because most parents don't understand the implication of their child watching these movies and then stereotyping this particular like trait or characteristics of minorities and replicating that particular behavior in future. No one is able to foresee that. No parent has the time to do that. Which means even if they are not racist to that extent, they probably don't care about their children because they don't understand that whether they're not able to understand those nuances on their side of the house. But even if they do, I'm pretty sure if parents are so careful about minorities, they probably would teach their children they don't need to expose that child to actually see that movie and then go on and explain about this behavior should not be tolerated. Because we gave you reasons that Disney is able to go, because we gave you reasons why Disney should do this. Then they say that, look, Disney doesn't, we hold that on their side of the house, they claim that Disney is better held accountable, right? Look, on our side of the house, Disney suffers a huge loss of revenue. That is to say, Disney will have to pay for its sins. It's not getting away on our side of the house. On your side, Disney continues to earn profits through the regions of the popular racist shows. But if Disney really cares about racism, that this disclaimer will be just a tokenistic move. So probably like if currently 100% of the people watch, now 70 probably there'll be a slight reduction in the number of people watching, but still people are going to watch those movies. So Disney continues to get the profit on their side of the house, right? Lastly, we prove to you, and this is the most important point. How much time do I have? Hello?
1 minute.
Cool. Okay. So here's the claim that here's the stance that we took from this debate, right? Look, when you're born and brought up by watching those Disney films, you tend to buy these stereotypes which are not related to. 4 things we prove to you. The reason you laugh at those depictions is because you think this behavior is not natural. Second of all, we prove to you, which means when you laugh at those depictions, you pass a value judgment on the culture, that the culture is very weird and sort of inferior to the culture of the majority and the culture of the whites. Minorities often have to bear the burden of teaching whites that it's an exaggerated version that don't normally behave like this. Because they don't have the social capital to actually re-educate those children, these children of that belong to the majority community tend to behave and tend to believe in those stereotypes. This leads to microaggressions. That is, when you go to schools and colleges, you sort of make fun of your minority friends, and those minority friends feel excluded. And this only happens when movies like this continue to get circulated, because they legitimize the behavior of racist people on their side of the house, right? When you ban Disney shows on our side of the house, you tell to the people world that the stereotypes are actually wrong, and you delegitimize all those conceptions that happen on their side of the house, that it's wrong for you to be a racist and it cannot be tolerated anymore. Those stereotypes are perfectly immoral, and you shouldn't believe in those stereotypes. When you have these shows in circulation, probably people believe the reason these are in circulation because there might be some element of truth in it, which is why probably people continue to actually exhibit those racist characters, racist behavior, and have distorted conceptions of the different cultures. Incredibly proud to propose.
I thank third affirmative. I invite third negative. Here.
Hello, testing my microphone. Can I be heard properly? Okay, nice, solid. All right. Okay, I'm going to start. There are 3 issues I will focus on in this speech to prove why we clearly win. Firstly, are children really that impressionable with respect to these outdated racist caricatures? Secondly, how will children interact with parents in society? And lastly, how will this affect the behavior of Disney as a company? Firstly, are children really that impressionable with respect to outdated racist caricatures? So affirmative relies, up until third affirmative, this characterization that they will laugh at these types of stereotypes, that they are impressionable because of short attention spans, they are not exposed to the real world and other minorities, and that there will be dominant portrayals on media so they have nothing else to turn to, and they're only going to watch these old shows over and over again. We have a few responses to prove why this is structurally untrue. Firstly, if kids do have short attention spans for short disclaimers, then we have structurally proven that they can have a lot of pop-up notifications, have a lot of trivia bubbles, or even, I don't know, put Tom Hanks, pause the show every now and then, and make a statement to say that Disney, in the same way Disney asks, did you see the hidden Mickey? Did you see the racist caricature? And be able to process information to a lot of these children. But that is structurally true and very much possible to capture the attention. If they are impressionable, they can be impressionable with respect to these disclaimers. But secondly, first negative already proved that these children have have other shows to watch, and that these shows are more progressive, more modern, and are probably more in diverse in representation. And this is important to characterize in this debate, because up until now, affirmative relies that because of nostalgia, because they're popular, because they're old, they will always be the ones that will be dominantly shown. But that is not true in the real world, even if they may watch this every now and then on Disney Plus. There are many reasons why this is likely to be true. One, because of new bias and recency bias. So they air it more. There's a profit incentive to air these shows that are newer and more diverse and more progressive more often, because of modern actors that are more popular with the public and more popular with these teens. Because demand for newer content like Star Wars and the remakes for Dumbo over and over again that are more progressive, that are different from what people know. But two, there are more reasons to believe that these viscerally appealing, like visually appealing different shows, like more nowadays are more modern, have a bigger production budget like the MCU. Three, because it's more profitable to be more diverse and more progressive now, because you cast a wider net and you're able to tap into more people because you don't want to get canceled. That it's more likely for the companies like Disney to try and wash away their past because they want to try and have more diverse representations in the future. But lastly, because Disney makes more and more remakes now. So the contrast is that on our side, you can have the new Dumbo and not have the blackface in it, but you can show that in the old Dumbo, you can see that visceral blackface material that was represented, and people can see that difference, and children can see it clearly for themselves. Affirmative tries to say and try to divert this response by saying that, oh, no, these shows are not going to be the outlier, but these shows will be the outlier rather than the norm. And the difference becomes so stark when it is a caricature. Remember, caricatures exaggerated from the realistic portrayals of most of these minorities and what people know of. And it's not that they're impressionable with respect to how they perceive minorities, they'll be impressionable with respect to how these information is going to be brought to them. So it doesn't need to be a complex essay that is going to teach them it. It has to shock them. It has to change them and make them curious. That's why they'll ask questions. That's why they might Google it. They might Google the old film and compare it to the newer film. That's why they might be able to look at the historical racism that comes behind it. And obviously, if affirmative relies on documentaries, then we have the same fiat too. If they can understand the documentaries, and presumably if they understand documentaries and they don't watch Peppa Pig, then on our side, they can understand the complex rationality that comes behind a simple disclaimer that this was racist before and there are newer portrayals that are better. Thirdly, to the extent that we have already proved that even if they have current stereotypes, this exaggeration in caricature doesn't confirm those stereotypes. It shows how unnatural it is, how terribly uncomforting watching a blackface portrayal is if you come from a black minority, for example, or how a caricature can show how unrealistic it is to how how you go to school, how you know that you have a lot of black friends now that are probably there that you interact with because you're an innocent child that is shy, that is socially inept, that you have a lot of reasons to believe that you have people in the community. And presumably that is more true now than it was 60 years ago because civil rights has improved. There are more people that you know. The communities have diversified more. Populations have boomed, and more people from minority groups are more visible to you, and therefore you interact with them more. But the last reason is this. The worst case is this. Children grow older and become more mature. So even if a child watched a lot of these racist caricatures when they are young, they have little impact on others, and they will have little impact if they were racist to others. It's not going to compound over time because there are more reasons to not believe that racism was true for a few reasons. One, these people are physically inept. They are probably a toddler. They can't harm others physically and bully other people. Two, they are shy, socially inept, and are likely to have other reasons to believe that they can have other interests, people to cooperate with children in schools, and they have other friends that they can turn to. But lastly, they can be corrected by teachers in a school place, or if they are going to bully someone else and say something that is racist in a school setting, if they are a toddler, or if they are someone in elementary school, there are people who are trained professionals to also regulate them. These are reasons that we can mitigate the worst harms of affirmative, but still get the benefits on our side. In our side, age is a self-correcting mechanism because of changing demographics, of other interactions, more education, and more critical reasons. Why we need these specific media and these specific movies is because you need to be reasonable to the extent that they can comprehend these documentaries and these disclaimers. That is why we need to contest parents. That is why we need to contest other portrayals, or at least the current perception of how these types of racism has been structurally taken away from their world now. If states have historically tried to erase it from history textbooks, then you can know it by looking at an old film from Disney. And that is a clear principle benefit that we get from our side for children. The second issue is this: how will children interact with parents in society? In response to second neg's argument on nostalgia and changing the incentives of parents, third affirmative tries to respond and say that there are other ways to teach racism, like a documentary or being able to portray it another way, but it doesn't respond to the root of the argument from second negative. We said if parents are actually going to use nostalgia of these films by being able to prop up that, oh, all of these newer films like Legend of Korra is so SJW and it's something you shouldn't watch. Why don't you go watch The Jungle Book? Why don't you look at all the films I've had before? It allows it to have a veneer of legitimacy that you cannot penetrate unless you actually watch it yourself. And I think some children, if they are even 10 years old, can even contest that to some degree because they say, Mom, that is something that I don't think is comfortable with me. It's not how I know the world to be. I don't think your show, the way you remember it, is the same way I remember it now because I can represent it in a different time, in a modern time, because Disney's portraying it in a different light. Secondly, in the situation where affirmative concedes that they can be good on either side, these parents can be good, then they concede to a clearer margin on our side that they can be actively capable of correcting the mistakes in the past. Remember, this is historical reparation and it's retrospective because you look back at an old story and you say that this was wrong. Now we need to go to newer portrayals, but their side only says we will erase the past and only look to our future portrayals. It doesn't erase the historical injustice that was done. But lastly, if they can't, if they can't likely teach it, then you need this catalyst for change. You needed to push people to look back and watch through these films because when my dad or mom agrees to watching an old version of Dumbo, they might think it was like this, it was really, really nice before, but now when they watch it with their child, it might have a different perspective. That is an amazing parental discussion that they can have that they can never have at affirmative. Last issue, how will this affect the behavior of Disney? So second affirmative says that they can have newer shows that are more diverse. One, we can have that. Two, but actually it'll be better on our side. Two, we can create an active mechanism that is probably going to make them pay these reparations more. But lastly, we can actually earn money with the model from first neg that we were able to provide to you, that they can actually earn money from these old shows. So if they might be prominent on our side, at least we have structural socioeconomic change for a lot of these communities or these charities that is not rebutted at all from a first affirmative until third affirmative. They say that no, it's like they can at least not earn money. Not earning money for these old shows is not an argument or it's not a value in this debate because they can always earn new films from Disney or from buying Fox or from other films, no matter what. That is value neutral. You have to believe the vast amount of benefits we get from negative to discourse, to money, to at least these structural communities and the perception they have on racism. For all this and more, I'm very proud to debate.
I thank third neg. I invite neg reply. Yeah.
Hello, can I be heard? Hello? I can be heard, right? Okay, wonderful. Let's make this debate simple and show why we win. Number one, AF has one main harm. It is that children will imbibe this racism and then express it to others through microaggression and through harm. Their main premise is that children are impressionable. If we disprove this premise, they have no outcome and we should win by default. We had 5 ways of deconstructing this premise. 1, we asked, why can't the content warning leave an impression? We changed the initial impression that children have. Even if they can't understand its racism, they can understand the simple idea that what they are about to see is wrong. Secondly, we asked, why can't a grotesque depiction or a comically enlarged depiction leave a negative impression? Their analysis has always relied on children being impressionable, but they never proved why it would be a positive impression of the real world and why they thought this would be the real world. We said this could leave a negative, fantastical impression and not one that translated to harming other individuals. Thirdly, we said you could laugh at villains and laugh at existing structures within the context of a cartoon and still believe that they are wrong. Why would children immediately believe that they are right? 4, AF mentions history books. So why can't history books correct for these depictions? If they are sufficient to correct the subtle racism of today, then they should be sufficient to correct the exaggerated caricatures of the past. This was why, when the main exposure of children to racism was subtle and hard to deconstruct, we said this would be harder for you to remove. Comparatively, it would be easier for us to fix it in the worst case, and in the best case, children could take this as a learning moment. Fifthly and lastly, AF has the point that you can easily teach racism to children in other ways. There were 2 responses from Luigi, Irene, and I. We asked, 1, didn't you say it is hard for children to understand racism? We agreed that it was hard. We agreed that existing depictions might be difficult and abstract for children to understand. Thus, it was exclusively caricatures that were necessary, especially when framed in the context of wrongness, of the sensation that this is not what your common man looks like and that this is not what reality looks like. This was why it was necessary to exclusively have racism as a broad stroke and not just the nuanced depictions relies on themselves. We needed we needed caricatures to work in conjunction with other forms of education. But lastly, we also pointed out that parents were unlikely to discuss racism unprompted, which was why we needed these content warnings. That's why we won the issue on children. But we also won on 2 other points. So these points were also important in that if you don't believe that we won it and that it was a deadlock, we won on 2 other marginal issues. The first is we pointed out that parents would be more likely to change. Af's point was that children and parents will trust Disney, but they don't fix it in any way. They just use it as analysis to prop up their argument. We said and spun it. We said that we adjusted how parents, specifically moderate parents, would teach their children. If it is the point that parents don't care, this is how we make them care by using big red flashing lights by saying you should really be rethinking how you evaluate your own life and your own childhood. So we allowed parents to have the tools to deconstruct their nostalgia and give children the tools to challenge parental authority. That's why we won the parental issue. And that's why even if this issue was hinged on good versus bad parents, we made more good parents, which is why we won that issue if you believed it was hinged on parents. But the second thing was on money. And here, this is a demolishing win for Negative Bench. And the reason for this is, like, Neg eventually just concedes that money is important, and they just try and co-opt it by saying they have money in other ways. We said that this money could exclusively only come from these films because this was the net loss in political capital that they lost by kicking it out of circulation. And the comparative difference was that Disney had the responsibility to fix and reparate for the harms that people experienced by making the life of minorities easier today. And we had more of that by not only making Disney do this, but enjoining other corporations to do this as well. So at the end of this debate, the answer is quite simple. You must negate. Thank you.
Am I audible? Great. Just give me 10 seconds, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Negative seems to live in a weird world where the viewers of Disney are toddlers who can't commit physical violence or bully, but can go on Google and read complex research papers on racism and can actually go and understand the nuances of the disclaimers. Look at the inherent contradiction which comes out in third Negative's entire analysis. My speech will have 2 things. The first, which side solves issues of racism? Second, what is this value of caricatures? The first thing they say is we can have disclaimers which are flashy and constantly playing throughout. Which means even on their side, you cannot literally have a disclaimer playing every 10 seconds. You realistically probably have it at the beginning of the show. This relies on the fact that the toddler, firstly, understands the meaning of those words, but secondly, even after noting the disclaimer down, understands the implicit racism and the mannerisms of the character and dissociates the character from truth, right? No reason to believe why toddlers are equipped to do that. But thirdly, all their mechanisms of correcting children's behavior relies on parents. At the point at which I'll be able to demolish that as a assumption, we think we'll take this debate. The reason, let's deal with all kinds of parents, right? The first kind of parents are probably parents who are very liberal and who care about their children a lot and have a lot of time on their hands. These parents can also discuss these complex issues on our side of the house through child-friendly documentaries, through normal discussions, and through authentic movies which depict minorities as they actually are. No reason to believe why these parents are exclusive to their side. But notice the 2 other kinds of parents, right? The conservative parents who on their side literally just ignore this, who are unaware about racism, who will never really go and talk about the children about this because they themselves don't know about these issues, but also moderate parents, right? Parents who might have an incentive to do so, but literally don't understand the implicit nuances of this character, which means the amount of correction they can do to the child is limited, and the child will go and cause microaggressions, if not really bullying and physical abuse. But let's move on to the second point, right? Why do you need caricatures to do this? They say caricatures are very realistic and engaging. We contest that premise when you tell you these caricatures are not fun movies where characters come and tell children, oh, racism is bad, oh, blackface is bad, right? They literally go and do all these things, and then they assume that children should now retrospectively go and think these things are bad, right? Which means on our side, the world we prefer is movies literally going and saying blackface is bad. Where the Indian actor is the main lead of that movie, we think that world is where you actually solve racism, right? And not retrospectively on their side of the house. What rather happens on their side is children probably think these things are okay, right? I go to school and mock my Indian friend for his accent. I see my black friend and look at his lips and laugh, right? This microaggression, which makes other people and the dignity demean, is extremely problematic. But notice this huge contradiction in Luigi's speech, right? When he concedes that these movies are old movies, which will never be watched again, Disney has an incentive to take them out, right? Their entire case is premised that these movies go and talk about racism and create information to people. At the point at which people stop watching these movies, how are any of the benefits of racism and racism being sustained ever come about? But secondly, right, they themselves say in Luigi's speech that the revenue will decrease now because people stop watching these movies. This shoots themselves in the foot because their entire case was premised about repercussions which Disney will pay through charities, etc. If Disney makes no money through these movies, how will they pay that charity money which they want to talk about? Notice the huge inherent contradictions in their speech. But why do we think we can depict racism even on our side? On their side, you rely on parents going and talking to the child and sitting with them watching Disney movies. We told you Disney is a trusted brand which parents think has always been associated with hundreds of years with children's movies. They are the trendsetters in the industry and everyone literally follows them. No analysis for why that's not true. Which means when we go and literally ask them to ban it and take these movies out of the public sphere, it sets a huge message to parents, right? Parents now stop trusting Disney. Disney is incentivized to not make such similar movies. The entire industry has repercussions. We told you all this in second affirmative, there was no response to this. But beyond this, right, they just claim, oh, these movies are unrealistic. That's absolutely untrue, right? These are depictions which people think are the truth about these people, right? Children don't get the opportunity to go to India and visit people, right? Not all children have diverse backgrounds in school, right? Children are literally live in their own bubble, and as per their own characterization, are toddlers who really don't understand the difference between these different things. At the end of my speech, we prove to you why this propagates racism, why parents are inadequate in doing so, and why banning this is the only solution to stop this systemic racism from propagating. For all these reasons, we're very proud to win from affirmative.
I thank affirmative reply, and with that, I thank